Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this latest installment of Cosmic Coffee. I am Jeff Hall. I'm an astronomer and the director of Lowell Observatory here in Flagstaff, Arizona on a fairly cloudy and snow-covered day because it's apparently that time of year here. And I'm joined this morning by Lowell Observatory Historian Kevin Schindler, who's been on a number of Cosmic Coffees before. Thanks for joining us again, Kevin.
Great to be back, Jeff.
So today we're going to delve a little bit into Lowell history. One of the first Cosmic Coffee episode of the year, we talked a little bit about technology, and we'll be doing some more technology shows as we go along. But I'd also like to do some shows that highlight some of the things that have gone before here at the observatory. You know, we have a staff of 120 right now and a lot of different programs, but we've been around for 126 years, and that's a lot of time for some very interesting things to have happened and some really interesting and accomplished people to have been here on Mars Hill and done some fundamental things. And for Cosmic Coffee today, we're going to talk about one of these very interesting and, as Kevin put it in his summary of the show, somewhat enigmatic figures, and that's Robert Burnham Jr. Now, I remember the summer that I was 16, which was more than 10 years ago, I saved up some money over the summer doing some odd jobs, and I purchased 3 volumes of a set called Burnham's Celestial Handbook. I've got the first volume right here, not showing up too well in front of my background. And, you know, I noted that he had worked at some place called Lowell Observatory, and of course, not knowing that I would eventually end up there. And this was a very influential series of books on me as a young person being interested in astronomy, not only for the astounding wealth of information that's presented, but the way that it's presented and the broad context of history and cultural tradition and art and poetry that Burnham weaves into his narratives. After a lengthy introduction, he then methodically goes through the 88 constellations in order, providing lists of star charts, but then these wonderful descriptive notes that even if you're not interested in astronomy, they're just fascinating reads for all of the little tidbits and sidebar notes that he brings in, really unique in the annals of astronomical literature and an essential part of any astronomer's bookshelf, in my opinion, whether you're a professional or an amateur. So Kevin, give me your thoughts on the handbook and its place and significance in the literature.
Oh, well, I echo what you say. I haven't been exposed to it as long as you have, although it's been more than 10 years since I would have been exposed at the same age. But I've been using it since I've worked here at Lowell Observatory, which is 26-ish years now. And, you know, it's amazing. Some of the data is out of date in terms of star positioning and such. But the information, as you said, is outstanding and is still such a great reference. And I'm not sure, it's not something you would just sit down and read cover to cover. But like, you know, anytime I want to find out about something in any of the constellations, that's the first thing I look at. Because, like you said, he's got so much cultural and historic information. And I think it goes back to who Robert Burnham was. You know, as a kid, I don't know, like a lot of kids, especially boys maybe, we were collectors. And he collected a lot of stuff, coins and fossils and rocks. And he incorporates that in this volume. So it's really a pretty neat thing. You know, in reading it, if you didn't know anything about him, after reading some of the selections, you would have learned something. It's kind of a peek into who that person was. And there's a lot more to him besides what you learn inside that volume, which we'll talk about today.
Absolutely. And you know, it's got to be like 2,000 pages. And you know, clearly in the version that I have, you know, it's typed, and just the perseverance and force of will to put something like this together and stick with it. I mean, I can think of other examples like that at Lowell, like the perseverance and meticulous approach that Clyde Tombaugh had to apply to searching hundreds of pairs of plates to look for this tiny little dot moving across the starry background. Likewise, this is a not only an incredibly learned person, but an interesting personality that has the wherewithal and resolve to produce something like this. So let's talk about the author and what formed Burnham into being able to create such an incredible work.
Sure. Well, I think with a lot of these things, we go back to the beginning. And for him, the beginning was in Chicago in 1931 when he was born. He would have a sister later on, so there were 2 kids in the family. When he was several years old, the family moved to Prescott, down south of Flagstaff, southwest. And Robert took to nature. He loved going out and collecting rocks and fossils. He collected coins. He liked looking at the night sky, and eventually he built his own telescopes, and he did a really good job with it. And so growing up for him was, some kids called him the professor, or nicknames like that, because he was quiet, shy, studious, very knowledgeable about things. And this was his life growing up. He just was fascinated by the world around him and learned about it on his own. He read books. He drew. He did a lot of art. So he did a lot of different things. Probably you would call him a loner. He did have some friends, but he was much of an introvert. And so he spent a lot of his time, kind of in his own mind, doing his own things. He graduated from Prescott High School. And after that, he stayed at home for a couple of years, and then he went to the Air Force. And he spent 2 years there. This is a great picture of he and his parents at their Prescott home when he was taking off for the Air Force. And of course, there in the background is his telescope. That's like part of his life all the time, it seems like, is this quest to learn about the universe around him. So he went into the Air Force, came back, and he moved back in with his parents, and his parents were fine with that. They would just soon he stayed there and lived as long as he wanted to. He took a clerk job, which was pretty kind of a not very inspiring thing, but you can imagine he got that done during the day, and then at nighttime when he was done, he would spend time looking at the heavens and studying his rocks. He set up a laboratory in the family home, and this is a picture of him in his lab. He's got, you can look at this and see there's models of dinosaurs. In the top center, this is one of his drawings of Saturn. He's got a microscope. He's got who knows what chemicals in here. Just a real scientifically minded person. And to me, it kind of harkens back to our founder, Percival Lowell, sort of a self-taught gentleman scientist, as it were. And not quite the same with Robert Burnham. He didn't come from wealth, but still, driven to learn on their own. And again, Clyde Tombaugh, you mentioned the same way. There was a drive within them to learn about the universe. And so this was Burnham's life. He would work the humdrum job during the daytime, and the nighttime he would, it's like he closed the door and opened to the universe around him. And this was his life for several years. And then it all sort of changed in 1957. And I apologize, this is a horrible picture, but it's the only copy of this I've been able to find is from an old newspaper. In 1957, one night, Burnham was outside looking through his telescope, and he saw this smudgy spot in the sky. And he contacted astronomers who knew about these things. And it turned out that this was a comet. Well, he knew it was a comet, but it was one that nobody had ever seen before that night. It turns out 2 other people on the same night that he saw it also. So they're all 3 considered to be the discoverers. But this made a lot of news for Robert Burnham. Here's this self-taught 20-something-year-old, and he discovered this comet. And a big part of how he got known for this was his mother. His mother constantly wrote letters to the editor of the local paper down in Prescott about politics, about all sorts of things. And so she wrote a letter to the paper and said, "My son has discovered this comet, huzzah." Well, it caught the attention of a lot of people, including future presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater thought this was a great thing. We think about the timing. This is the late 50s. It was right after Sputnik flew into space, and the Soviets, oh my gosh, the Soviets are ahead of us in the Cold War, and they've taken the lead in what will become known as the space race. And Barry Goldwater, saw the discovery of this comet by this young guy is, hope for America, that we have, the future looks bright because we have good minds that are looking out into space, and they're going to help us catch up with the Russians. So Barry Goldwater, there were certainly some politics in him meeting with Robert Burnham, but they met, and it made more news. And Goldwater even gave him a family telescope that went back to the 1800s. So there was definitely a bond they developed there. So that was kind of a turning point in Burnham's life in 1957.
Right. And of course, at that point, as you said, they'd moved to Prescott. So he's at this point, instead of Chicago, kind of in our neck of the woods. And so was it, I guess it was this visibility or astronomical prominence that he gained from this that ended up having him come to Flagstaff and to Lowell?
Right. Thanks to his mom promoting him. And then this meeting with Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, it hit the newspapers. And certainly Lowell Observatory found out. And one of the astronomers here, Henry Gickless, who was a longtime astronomer at the observatory, he was just starting a survey of the sky called a proper motion survey. And, if we go back a couple decades before that, Clyde Tombaugh was brought in the late 1920s to systematically photograph the sky to search for a planet. He discovered Pluto, and then he spent another decade photographing most of the rest of the sky, looking for other planets. And he made a really great survey of the sky. Well, 20 years later, Henry Gickless came along and said, let's rephotograph what Clyde did, and then we'll compare the current images to those older ones he took, and we can look at the position of stars and see how they changed over time, something called proper motion. And so Henry was just starting this program and read this story in the paper about a local kid who knew this guy. And so he got a hold of Burnham. And from that, Henry Gickless invited Robert to work at Lowell Observatory. What a spectacular thing. And again, Jeff, as you mentioned with Clyde Tombaugh, there's some parallels.
Yeah.
Clyde living on a farm in Kansas, made drawings of the night sky, sent them to the observatory. They saw an eager young person knowledgeable about the night sky, invited Clyde to work at the observatory. Similar thing with Robert Burnham. Well, he came on board, and he worked with another fellow that did most of this work, Norm Thomas. They would photograph the night sky using the same telescope that Clyde did, and that's the Lawrence Lowell telescope that most of us know better as Pluto Discovery Telescope, which, as we reopen for regular tours, guests can come up and see this telescope. Here's a picture of Robert with that telescope. And so he would spend his time photographing at night. Then at the daytime, he and here's Norm, up above, they would put these photographic glass plates on this machine called a blink comparator. And this was a little bit different than the one that Clyde Tombaugh used to discover Pluto, but the same idea that they would survey these glass plates and study and measure the positions of the stars. So that sounds like a pretty busy schedule to me. Photographing at night, analyzing during daytime. But again, Robert was, he was kind of a solitary guy. So when he wasn't, quote unquote, working, he was working. He was collecting fossils, looking at the night sky. This is a display case in the cabin he lived in here at the observatory. You can see lots of minerals and other stuff in there. So he spent a lot of time doing that. He continued doing his paintings. This is one of a drawing he did. And then he worked on this other project that we started this program with, and that was this handbook. Initially, he began it as a way of just keeping track of all this information, kind of more of a personal reference guide for him. But then it evolved into something he thought he could compile, others would be interested in it, and maybe he could even make some money off of it. And so the first two volumes of this, the picture we showed, and you held up the volumes, Jeff, those were printed later on by Dover, and you can buy those as a 3-volume set. But initially, when he published this, he printed them as loose leaf pages, and then he assembled them himself. In fact, I'm sitting in the Slifer building at the observatory, where your office is also. Maybe you're down there also, I'm not sure.
I'm downstairs from you.
Well, down in the basement, where our night operations team now has an office, Robert would go down there with some of the kids who lived up here at Mars Hill at the time, and they would set up tables and line up pages, and they would just, factory style assemble these pages and put them in these 3-ring binders. So this was something, like you were saying, it's mind-boggling what he did to create this manual, but this was in his off time. He was working full-time doing the proper motion survey, and this was something that he did in the side. And I'll point out, I just saw a question here from Chris.
Yep.
The plates that he and Norm were taking were 14 by 17 inch, which are the same size as the ones that Clyde Tombaugh took, so they could match them up.
Yeah, they're big. It's impressive to pull them out of the shelf in the plate vault, and it's just these enormous glass plates.
And it's kind of neat, the timing with this program also, because our archives folks working with astronomer Stephen Levine have gotten money to start scanning these old plates.
Yeah.
Which is critical because the information on them is still very useful. And so being able to digitize them, rather than having a glass plate that you have to digitize one-on-one, we digitize them all, then that information is available to modern astronomers.
Right. We're really excited about this project, and it's just getting underway. But yeah, I mean, down in the basement, there are thousands and thousands of these things just sitting on shelves, inaccessible. And, as you pointed out, you've got the Pluto search plates, and then the proper motion plates. So these are taken decades apart. And, I just have to imagine the wealth of unknown information on transient phenomena in the universe that might be in there. If we could make those available in a digital portal of some sort, would be incredibly valuable to have for us and for the astronomical community.
And as an example of the use of this stuff, this is a kind of a neat example, I guess, but several years ago when Alan Stern and his team, that includes Will Grundy here at Lowell, when they were planning New Horizons and the flight of New Horizons as it was approaching Pluto, up till the end, they were trying to constantly refine, the exact position of Pluto. And to do this, you look at old observations to pinpoint, its orbit. And they looked at old photographic plates taken in the 1930s by Carl Lamplund of Pluto. And by scanning those, Mark Bowie, who used to work at the observatory, looked at those, and it helped them tweak our understanding of the orbit of Pluto a little bit, which allowed them to tweak how New Horizons was flying out there. So this stuff is really very useful.
Indeed. So there's another question from Chris. The plates at the prime focus. What kind of focal length F ratio of the Pluto's telescope?
I'll have to look that up. I can't.
Yeah.
It's like somebody asks you your phone number, and I have to think about that. So we can look that up and get back on that.
Right. All right. So I came to Lowell in August of 1992, and I had among the rest of my household the copies of the handbook in tow, and they've been on my shelf here ever since I've been here as a postdoc. But even at that point, Burnham was already, I knew Norm Thomas, who was obviously still here for a while and then retired until he passed away fairly recently. But obviously never knew Burnham because he was no longer here, and nobody really knew anything about him at that point. So let's go to this phase of his life and what happened following the publication of the handbook and, of course, the end of the proper motion survey.
Sure. Well, the handbook is published, and Burnham sold the rights to Dover, hoping to make a lot of money. And there are a lot of issues with that he never did. But after working here 20 years, the proper motion survey ended. And the observatory offered Robert a couple jobs, like helping clean up, because there was not money for anything else at the time. But he wanted to leave, that wasn't suited for what he wanted to do. So he ended up leaving the observatory. And from there, his story gets really murky. And it's confusing also because there was also another person by the name of Robert Burnham, who for years was editor of one of the leading trade journals, Astronomy Magazine. And so most people figured that was Robert Burnham of Burnham's Celestial Handbook. But our Robert Burnham was Robert Burnham Jr., different Robert Burnham. And so there was that confusion that, okay, this guy is still, doing his thing, doing astronomy. The story didn't really come out until the early 1990s. A journalist, Tony Ortega, who was down in Phoenix at the time, heard about Burnham, and Tony was interested in the nice guy and certainly knew the handbook. And so he started doing research, figuring out whatever happened to Robert Burnham. And it turns out that Robert Burnham died in 1993. And Tony started piecing together what happened. Apparently, after Robert left here, he went to live with his sister in Phoenix for a little bit. That didn't last very long. They had a falling out of sorts, and Robert sort of disappeared. And it turns out he ended up in San Diego at Balboa Park. And this was tracked down because Norm Thomas's son, Bruce, was over there at Balboa Park visiting the museums and whatever. And he was walking down the sidewalk, and he saw this bearded, skinny guy. And he looked at him and said, "My gosh, that looks like Robert Burnham." He walked up to him and said, "Robert?" And apparently Robert looked up and just casually said, "Hi, Bruce, how are you?" I mean, this is just so surreal to think they haven't seen each other in years. Nobody really knew what happened to him. Yeah. And it turns out Robert ended up in San Diego living in a run-down, old converted hotel type place.
And I was going to ask if he was actually homeless, or did he have a place where he was?
He had a place where he lived, and then he spent his time in Balboa Park, where visitors walking back and forth, and he was selling paintings of cats. And this is one of the paintings, and it just blows your mind what happens. And it turns out that we haven't talked about this yet, but we hinted at it that Robert was certainly introverted. As our former director Bob Millis said, he was so shy. Bob said he was the shyest person he ever met. And in talking to Robert's only living relative, his niece Donna Courtney, she said that the family suspected that there was some emotional or other problem that Robert had, and they suggested he go and seek counseling. But she said that he decided not to, perhaps because he thought he might be locked up. So there were some sort of psychological issues going on. When he was at Lowell, it was very straightforward. He worked on the prep promotion, and then, he would do his explorations of the universe, writing his handbook and collecting his minerals and such. But when that structure was gone, he was lost, and he ended up on the streets of San Diego selling pictures of cats. You think about the talent and knowledge he had, and this was kind of the end for him. It turns out he died at the age of 61 in 1993, and just to add insult to injury, because of his time in the Air Force, he's memorialized at a military cemetery in San Diego, and they misspelled his name initially. So his family didn't even know that he had died. Once they found out, they worked through the network to correct the misspelling. But what a sad thing. I mean, this guy that Burnham's Celestial Handbook in Astronomy, everybody knew. This guy was a legend in terms of the publication he wrote, and yet from the personal side, it was tragic. He was on his own and kind of died and nobody realized it. So in recent years, and I say recent, the last 10 years or so, there have been efforts to remember him. 10 years ago or so, thanks to Tom and Jennifer Polakis and other amateur astronomers in Phoenix, they collected money to create a plaque to Robert that's on this rock. And this rock has been moved up a little bit, but it's along our Pluto walk here at the observatory. And then we're also putting together a small display that we're going to be putting in the Rotunda Museum that we were going to do last year, but that got sidetracked with certain other things going on in the world. So hopefully this year we'll be able to open it. But, just what a bizarre life and story, to think, I think everybody who knew the Celestial Handbook was shocked to find out about what happened to Robert Burnham, and just remarkable. And I just want to add here, I just see a comment from Donna coming in. Hello, Donna. And Donna and Tony have been really instrumental in helping us get more information about Robert and, really telling his story, which is really important. And Donna just wrote, Uncle Robert was brilliant, but seemed to be completely lacking the common survival instincts and skills most of us have. And, thus is part of that tragedy of his life. Thankfully, he left something that is legendary, and so he's not another person that has some of those issues that's forgotten. We can remember Robert and his contributions.
Yeah, as well we should. Certainly, an incredibly tragic end to an incredible mind. I mean, and I think that's captured in this quote. Obviously for Robert, astronomy was not merely a hard physical science. It was this beautiful combination of science and art and beauty, which we see every day in things we do. I've commented before. The first time I looked at the freshly coated mirror of the Lowell Discovery Telescope, it's not only an incredible feat of engineering, but that gentle hyperbolic curve it's mathematics, it's beauty, it's art, all wrapped up into one. And I think that's why I find the handbook so incredibly appealing, because of its how he weaves those artistic and threads of beauty into it. Clearly a remarkable mind. And I think we're very fortunate that he was here at Lowell and associated his handbook with his time at Lowell, because it's an inspiring work that I would heartily commend to anyone, professional or amateur, who's interested in the universe.
And that's interesting you said that, Jeff, because my use of the handbook, in the astronomy world, there's constant talk about it, that the handbook needs to be updated because the physical data needs to be refined. But I've never looked at it for that. I look at it for just what you're talking about, the poetry and the stories. And, he dug this stuff up before the internet, where we can get on and search for information. This was before those days. It's remarkable the amount of time he spent doing this.
Yeah.
And that's, he has a full-time job. This is all stuff that he did on the side. He was, it'd be fascinating to sit down and talk to him. And yet, based on stories we've heard, that could be difficult to do. Although, he felt very comfortable with some people. The kids on the Hill, I think, were really good friends of his. Donna talks about when she used to come up to visit and, bringing a boyfriend one time and not sure if she should take him in or not because, wasn't sure how Robert would react. But just her going in, he was really comfortable with Donna and we'd have cookies out and really a great, relationship. So it's really, it's a story for, psychologists to help solve.
Yeah, I can certainly see the I'm not a psychiatrist or anything, but you can certainly see that I think some of the characteristics maybe that Donna mentions and this extreme introversion and just a monomaniacal focus on what he was doing, ironically, maybe gave some of the perseverance to produce a work like this. And I've got the dedication to the entire handbook right here. I see some names I recognize, like, Nicholas Franz, Otto's son, but, he says the Celestial Handbook is affectionately dedicated to all the young friends who have traveled with me to the far reaches of the universe. May there always be starlight on the path. And, just a nice turn of phrase that I think gives a little glimpse into the kind of person Robert was.
And, I think, as the last couple of years, especially as we've, talked to people like Tony, who painstakingly tracked down so much of this information we know today of what happened to Robert, and talking to Donna, I think it's a story that we're still unraveling. I think one of the important things for me is, for years there was kind of this idea that when Robert left Lowell, the observatory dumped him. They could have found money. The prop promotion survey ended, but why didn't they find money for somebody who had been here 21 years? And I think in talking to, Bob Millis and others that were here at the time, it's not a black and white thing, because there was kind of that tragedy of Robert's personality, of where he could fit in another project. And certainly funding was an issue also. This was an era that there wasn't a lot of funding at the observatory. But still, I think that's part of the tragedy of it all, is that it wasn't, going back, it just wasn't an easy thing. There wasn't an obvious fit. There wasn't the money. And trying to, all we can do today is look back and say, boy, what a great contributions he made. Let's celebrate that legacy.
Right. It's easy to judge, especially with incomplete data. But of course, I know and knew Bob Millis and Henry Gickless well, and they're not unkind people. Quite the contrary. So we obviously, I don't know what was going on back then, and I'm sure that if the decision was they couldn't support Robert, I'm sure that was not an easy one for them. And as you say, what we will do now is we want people to know about Robert and his contribution here. So, once the circumstances allow us to be getting these new exhibits in place and visitors back on the Hill, we definitely want everyone to know about his contributions. So I'll ask for any final questions in the chat before we sign off, and just say once again, this is one of several Cosmic Coffees I'd like to do on some of the really interesting figures that have worked here over the years. And because of this monumental 3-volume work, Robert Burnham seemed a good one to start with. We will be doing some others, so tune in for those shows. when they come up. And I think you'll find there's some very interesting stories that we have to tell. So,
well, Jeff, I just like to say as we're winding down, another thank you to Tom and Jennifer Palakis, Tony Ortega, and Donna for helping bring a lot of this information about Robert out, which is really important. And there are a lot of people out there, amateurs and professional astronomers, who have used the handbook or have been influenced, and we'd love to hear your stories. So, let us know.
Yep. When we can be open? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
We just want to keep, trying to piece these things together. And
okay. There is a question there, Kevin. You can probably see it too from Chris.
Right. And it's what happened to Robert's personal effects from the early years? Did any of his lab or mineral collection survive? I know that, and Donna may comment on this, Donna has, I think, a couple of the paintings. In terms of the other stuff, the minerals and such, it's unclear what might have happened with that, although after Robert moved away, Brian Skiff lived in that cabin for years, and he had remembered seeing some rocks and minerals around the place. And so last year, I took my granddaughter over there, and we dug through the flower pots and found some pieces of petrified wood and other minerals that seemed pretty clear that they were things that Robert had collected. And so we've held on to all those. Donna says that yes, she does have a few possessions of that were Robert. So there's a few of those things still around. We found some of these minerals and rocks that he had collected, not a lot, but a few of them. And I should sum up that also the cabin that he lived in, we just had a raise, a couple months back now because of safety concerns and all. But we saved a few pieces of that cabin and some of the pieces of brick. Again, part of the testament of not only Robert, but others who had lived in that place. But, though that cabin's gone and Robert's no longer here, those are stories that we're trying to preserve here.
Yep, as indeed we will. And yeah, the poor cabin was just falling apart. It was uninhabitable. So as soon as we can get back up and running and inviting people up here, we will be developing this remembrance of Robert in the rotunda. And I'm very pleased that he was here. I'd like to thank you, Donna, for joining us today, and for all of you. And as always, until next Thursday, stay well, stay healthy as we hopefully come out of this situation that we're all in and can welcome you back to Mars Hill in the near future. Until then, be well.